Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. I'm in front of Chester House on Wimbledon Common in London. So I'm not quite sure why it's called Chester House, but it dates to the very early 18th century. Anyway, this was the house of John Horne Tooke. So John Horne, as he was born in 1736, lived in Westminster, which is now considered part of London, but in those days was officially a separate city just beside London. And his father was a fowler, so he was in the bird business and selling these. He prospered in his trade, was head of the Poulterers Company, which is more like a sort of trade association, not a company as such. So John Horne, he then went to Eton, where people mocked him for his father being a turkey merchant. So it's not true that everyone who went there was very wealthy. He's obviously better off than most people. And it's not true that everyone was blue blood and broad acres, even in the 18th century. Anyway, from there he went up to St John's College, Cambridge, was a sizar, which is a sort of undergraduate who had to perform some duties for others in order to get his bed and board. So he did reasonably well there. He graduated with a BA. He was much later to go back to Cambridge to ask for the MA, because 7 years after matriculation, assuming you'd passed your BA, you would be awarded an MA, just as a mark of senior status in the university, without doing any further academic work. And that's still the case at Oxford and Cambridge. That's why I say MA, Oxon in brackets, as in from Oxford, to show it's not a master's degree achieved through postgraduate study, or likewise MA Can-Tab. And the Scottish universities, the four oldest ones, St Andrews, Aberdeen, Edinburgh and Glasgow, they award MA as an undergraduate degree. Your first degree, so after 4 years of study, you get that straight away. They never award bachelors. But anyway, back to John Horne as he then was. He read for the bar, but wasn't actually called to the bar, as in qualified as a barrister, a lawyer, didn't do that. And eventually he decided that he wished to be ordained, so he was ordained in the Church of England. And he was fascinated by radical politics and was friends of most of the sort of radical people in late 18th century London. This is the time when the Society for Constitutional Information was going, exposing just how ludicrous the system of rotten boroughs was. Of course, it's more than a trifle hypocritical of John Horne Tooke. He later took the name Tooke because he represented Old Sarum, which is a constituency just outside Salisbury. The old name for Salisbury is New Sarum. And Old Sarum was just a pile of ruins. Nobody lived there, and I think only 7 men had the right to vote, owned the burgages, as in the properties which conferred the right to vote there. So pointing out just how crazily inequitable the system was, where Yorkshire, with over 1 million souls, had 2 members of parliament. Rutland, with about 8,000 people, also had 2 members of parliament, things like that. There were big cities like Manchester, which only counted as part of Lancashire, and had 2 MPs in as much as a part of Lancashire, wasn't actually a borough, because in the Middle Ages, towns were made boroughs, granted a charter, and if you're a borough, you had 2 MPs. And they didn't update this. They took no account of the rise and fall in population anywhere. So he said, this is crazy, and we ought to extend the right to vote to more people. Although he was a Tory, and the Tories tended to be adamantine in their opposition to reform, he wasn't. And indeed, some of the Whigs set their face against reform, but it was Whigs who tended to be in these reformist societies, the London Corresponding Society, and so on, the Society of Friends of the People. That's more like coming into, 1792, that one was formed. The Yorkshire Association, founded by the Reverend Christopher Wivel, another Anglican cleric, who said that it's grossly unfair that Yorkshire, which is the largest county in England geographically, has only 2 members of parliament. So we ought to have more in view of our huge population and area. Eventually that was addressed, and Yorkshire got 4 MPs, but that was still nowhere near representing it fairly in relation to the number of people who inhabited the county. But anyway, so he had a friend, John Horne had a friend who was a Mr. Tooke, and so in honour of his friend, he took the additional surname Tooke, Tooke. I believe it's pronounced Tooke and not Took. Anyway, so when he wanted to get his master's degree from the University of Cambridge, there was much grumbling and opposition because people didn't like his views, but he was granted it anyway. So as I say, it may seem incongruous that he was a Tory in view of the fact that the Tory party later evolved into the Conservative Party, and they would tend to be deeply sceptical of reform. Often Conservatives quote Lord Falkland, who in the early 17th century said that which it is not necessary to reform, it is necessary not to reform. So they start out with a prejudice against modernisation. They would only agree to modernisation if they think it's needed. Anyway, so John Horne was a thorn in the side of the government, criticising them over all sorts of things. And so the government decided they wanted to get rid of him. So they passed a special law saying that anyone who'd been episcopally ordained was disbarred from sitting in the House of Commons. They could be in the House of Lords. Remember, there are Anglican bishops in the House of Lords. So therefore, John Horne Tooke couldn't get in. By the way, he tended to be known as Horne Tooke from this point onwards, not John Horne Tooke. And that legislation remained on the statute book to about the year 2000. I hear you say, what about the Reverend Ian Paisley or the Reverend Martin Smith, these Unionist MPs from Northern Ireland? Well, they were not in holy orders because they were from non-conformist churches, a Free Presbyterian and a Methodist, respectfully. They didn't believe in apostolic succession, as in Jesus chose the 12 apostles, or 12 disciples if you prefer, and the idea is they are the first bishops. So they ordained bishops who ordained bishops who ordained bishops right down to today, and anyone ordained in the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church, these people, they have apostolic succession, they are in holy orders, whereas non-conformists don't believe in calling it holy orders when someone becomes a minister of their religion. They don't have bishops, they don't believe in apostolic succession. So John Horne Tooke, he later retired to this place, Chester House, in his infirmity, because he's got a rather large garden. It's still inhabited. It's not open to the public, I'm afraid. And he became something of a litterateur, and he was supposedly a fantastic chatterbox, just as amusing and lucid in person as he was on the page. And this was an era of people who were superb raconteurs. So if you want a good confabulation, you'd come here. That's why there was Granville Conversation Sharp was another one like that, a bit like Dr. Samuel Johnson. But the thing is, Horne Tooke had no James Boswell figure to be his amanuensis. So we can't see into it terribly well. I'm afraid I forgot my selfie stick, so I'm doing it the old-fashioned way, filming in there. That's John Horne Tooke's house, and so he didn't have very much money towards the end of his life, but he had some affluent friends, and they showed great liberality towards him. So people came here for his famous tea parties. Anyway, he died here in 1812, but he's buried with his mother in Ealing. We're south of the River Thames, that's north of the River Thames, that's maybe 8 miles from here as the crow flies. I'm not sure exactly where he's interned. So that law that the government passed simply to get rid of Horne Tooke was only repealed in about 2000 because the Labour Party, they selected a former Catholic priest as their candidate for a constituency in Scotland, and of course he would not have been able to take a seat. So legislation was passed allowing anyone who had been in holy orders to enter the House of Commons. That also allowed Chris Bryant, a Labour MP who was once an Anglican cleric. He too would not have been allowed to take a seat under the old dispensation. So that is John Horne Tooke, a fascinating figure, someone who ought to be more widely studied.